Saludo mi gente, es la comadre here, and I had told you I wanted to share with you the keynote that I did earlier last week, I believe. At this point, all the days continue to run, for the Keystone Crisis Intervention Team Conference. The name of the conference was Conscious Resilience, and you can I want to say go to my social media. You'll probably find a link there if you want to listen to the recordings. It was free, which is wonderful. Um, excuse me. And one of the things that, sorry, I'm like thinking about the KCIT acronym. One of the things to know about this keynote, I'm just going to give you kind of like a summary walkthrough of the things I talked about, but also kind of some behind the scenes about when I created this keynote and kind of my movement through it. So when I first played with the title Cultivating a Dynamic Healing Centered Praxis, was actually when I was invited to do this keynote was sometime last year, I believe. Um, which was I was so excited about it. Um, and at that time, I was actually studying. I was about to study um, my first semester, which I had chosen to focus on decolonial framework or decolonization and anti-racism trainings, because it's something that I don't see a lot of. And so my frame then was kind of this, dynamic healing centered idea. Healing centered is not my personal language or name for it in that way. It actually comes from Dr. Sean Ginwright. I need to get that together because I don't like saying his name incorrectly. But he's done some amazing work with youth and kind of shifting the trauma informed language into healing centered language, which I think is beautiful. And then, of course, in the evolution of all things, I've decided to go a step further. So this will change in the slides, and you'll notice because when I came back to organize the slide, first of all, I have a natural resistance to PowerPoints. So having this natural resistance to PowerPoints, um, I'm always looking for ways to honor what I feel would be most generative for a space. So that's why it's not a long keynote. It's not a long like PowerPoint thing. Really, it is a container created to bring us into ourselves and to reground the particular audience that this was going to reach, which is like social workers and crisis intervention workers, like just moving across many contexts. And so, because of that, it became a priority. And it always usually is. I try to explain to folks when I'm doing teachings and when we're in something that I, at times, most of the time, do it from a frame of like embodying, going through the process, building the internal capacity for complexity in a subject matter or in a thing itself. Um, because we have become addicted to PowerPoints, to being told what to do, to being told what to think. And one of the things that you can't mistake when you're working in a social justice or social work field or any like contextual trauma field, like it's your humanity that people begin to lose in the process of the work and forget in others. And so to be able to come back and say, okay, I want you to start thinking about the ways you inhabit your humanity, because how are you making space for anybody else, right? So that's kind of the frame that I started moving in. So the next slide you're going to see is the quote from Leah Lakshmi Pimsa Samarasina. I hope that I said that correctly. This book has changed my life. This book has given me language and given me space to see myself from like the place of being able to name that I am not able bodied and that the distinctions of what my needs um, are are part of the disability framework, right? Justice framework. And so this kind of, and I think I've spoken to folks about this in some ways or another, where I'm talking about like trying to create work in the world from an able body mentality or or ableism internalized, is probably one of the worst experiences, because you're trying to operate how, you know, people recommend you operate with your work, but you don't operate in those particular conditions. So this work is beautiful. And the quote to me was about reframing the way we're looking at caring for others, ourselves, and each other. Because to me, it's about collective care consciousness and no longer just self care. Because, well, for me, and I've shared this, I'm done with everybody tossing their responsibility on one individual for the things it's taken a collective systemic oppression, right, in all its manifestations to create the issues and the challenges. It's going to take collective care to even remotely get us to a place where we feel where we're not as depleted, that we're just inaccessible to ourselves. To be inaccessible to others is one thing. To be inaccessible to oneself, because we're so tapped out, is a really difficult place to inhabit. And so being able to shift this both internally as an individual and then collectively and then organizationally is going to be the place of radical embodied change, right? When our organizations can live through what Leah is saying here, right, then we know we're in a direction that is going to be generative for community, and that's going to be powerful. But if you're still apologizing for having needs, for starting late, for moving slower, for not being to the 3 meetings, and I hear this so much, then we're not where we need to be, right? Because we're still apologizing for things that are our humanity. So I wanted to frame this to give folks a container to step into with me for the next, it was like an hour and a half keynote. And I wanted folks to have this space to understand ecology, that their relationship to their care and to communal care is in direct relationship to the work, and the work that impacts those that are impacted by marginalization, right? And so it's like, okay, wait a minute. It's not just you for your self-care, but your self-care is actually also communal care, and being supported by community helps us all. So that when you show up for work, you're not being, a complete ass because the last time you were supported was, I don't know, when you were in your 20s. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know what that can look like, but I do know that organizations, unless they begin to change and be much more responsive to the needs, will, if their burnout rate is bad now, it will continue to increase until the field itself will suffer. So I have a lot to say about that, but I'm not going to do it here now. The next slide is my credentials. So I'm sure you know by now, I'm an Aquarius sun. I really have no choice but to buck convention and normative things. And so I didn't want to put up certifications or shit like that. I had no interest in that. But what I did have an interest in is all the ways that the work can look. And these images are all a testament to that, right? The NAACP, the trainings, creating art, mixed media art, and like the wearing the sock difference it's not just a metaphor, but it's like this, people could not focus on what I was saying because they were worried about telling me that my sock was stuck inside, or my pant leg was stuck inside my sock. Because that we're more preoccupied about those things than we are about stepping deep into our listening. The glasses are about perspectives, and then here's community gardens I've been involved with, women's leadership circles that I taught for a while. And here, the bottom image with the people standing and the guy in the blue shirt, that is a program that Eli Weaver from Lancaster Pharmacy and myself created to bring youth from the intervention center into the herbal field, so that they can see that there's different ways of living, and that medicine is also like informed living beings that we get to be in relationship with. I wanted that as a context rather than to feed the continual need to be approved of or validated or qualified. What makes me qualified is that I've lived my experience. I'm not just doing a theory, just an idea. I'm doing the work as a human being, right? Like, and that holds a lot of tension. I also, do weddings and things like that. So it was important to bring that. Ultimately, this is my cred. My cred is these two human beings here. I was a teenage mom, so that was me when I was 16. Yeah, 16, 17-ish. And there is my ladybug, who's grown into such a beautiful human being. They are amazing, and so is my son. So I call them my sun and my moon. He's an incredible human being as well, and I'm so grateful for their friendship, their counsel, their love. And that everything else can go away. Those are the two most powerful expressions of contribution I can ever possibly offer the world, right? So again, important to refocus and reframe what matters most. Next up, I dedicated this keynote and my work to my mom, Vilma Rosado Torres, but Geraldine Aide Torres. And she passed away last year, for those that don't know. And as a woman of color, she worked so hard. In this picture, she was so happy because she was going to nursing school. Things were moving in a direction that were bringing her joy. And she found so much joy in learning. And so dedicating this keynote to her and all her work, and all the ways that she also burnt out because her system couldn't take it. And so wanting to honor creating space for a different conversation around sustainability. So I dedicated it to her. Acknowledgements, as usual in my work, I try to be as conscious as possible around the land that I'm on, the people that are stewards of the land. We're all like relatives, and we all come from a cosmology that has to do with being deeply related to the land. And there's also a people of this land that are displaced and have experienced violence because of the work and who they are. And so to be able to name that we, if you will, we're settlers, depending how we came here. Some of us are settlers, some of us were brought by the slave trade. And so many different narratives all brought to Turtle Island in the idea of a colonial conquest. And that is an important piece of history that needs to be named and acknowledged. So I am on the land of the Susquehannock tribe, and I think you've heard me say this before. And I live 3 blocks from the river, one of the older rivers that, as much as I can, I try to sit and download and be with. So that was something that was part of the time. Then I created the Wall of Mourning, and the Wall of Mourning for me, kind of like similar to the Kotel, right, in Israel, the Wailing Wall. And it's a place of acknowledging what is hurting, what we're hurting collectively. And so here is the Black Lives Matter, like say their names. It was so important to name this for me, and also like talk about and mention Indigenous lives also that are being murdered, and BIPOC, trans lives, like all of the, not generalizing it, but all of the container of blood that's being shed. It was important to presence that, because We cannot, and this, a lot of my work is shifting in that way. We cannot continue to, I'm going to point out these things you need to be in learning, and we're going to ignore that your psyche, or that as a collective we're experiencing violence, ongoing violence, and we're not going to name that because your body is living in reaction to that every day. And so I wanted to make sure that we named, Black Lives Matter, period. And here we have the fires that have been happening and the climate justice and injustice that is occurring as we speak. And then also like climate justice as part of right relationship. COVID-19, the lives lost. We're all holding the heaviness around all that's shifting and changing. Ultimately, I don't know who did this image, so I take no credit for it. But all of this is centered in violence, right? Ooh, let me move back. Okay. All of it is centered in violence, right? And that is an important distinction that we need to name. Because what's happening is these have been so systemic, so entrenched in the systems that they've become the norm. And because they've become what is considered the norm, the way things are, we are not attuned to or attentive to the fact that it constitutes violence. And it's time. It's time to shift this shit on some real shit. It is time to shift it. And so it was important to show how this all is connected. The next up is another quote, which I love because there's a truth that Leah is telling here that we are refusing to see. We are refusing to acknowledge. One of the things that I strongly dislike, I strongly dislike when I hear people in movement work talk about who's showing up and who's not showing up. That to me has been a point of contention for as long as I've been doing this work. And my kids were homeschooled, so I didn't have a whole bunch of involvement in the school districts. My work has had some involvement in that. And so when I've shown up in those spaces, it's often to remind folks on some like basic shit. Is like, cut the shit out with trying to guilt people into volunteering and doing shit. People are trying to survive and take care of their families the best they can and are working several jobs to make ends meet. Stop guilting folks into something that is not actually working, that is consuming a lot of time, but very little fruit, very little like embodied action that is actually supporting whatever container this is meant to work with. And so I love that Leah mentions our movements are so burnt out, paced, with little to no room for grief, anger, trauma, spirituality, disability, aging, parenting, or sickness, that many people leave them when they age, have kids, get sick or sicker, or more disabled, or just can't make it to the 12 meetings a week anymore. And so that's something that to me needs to change. Of course, along with everything else, it's like the curve is really huge. So, but I wanted to presence this. I wanted to name it because I want us to begin to change that culture that does this, we want a seat at the table. The table's the seat is revolving, and what I want us to be able to step into is a collective consciousness around collective care. Next up is defining terms. So this is where you'll see that I shifted. So here it is. Cultivating. I crossed out try. I don't want us trying. Cultivating is to acquire or develop a quality, a sentiment, or skill. And of course, using the same energy and idea around gardening, right? And around ecology is to understand the ways in which we're slowly tending. A garden, I mean, you could open up the ground, you could set it all up, but nothing's going to change that something must start from seed or from a small little, like tiny little plant or whatever leaf, and then has to go through the process of sun and water in order to continue to produce and grow, and then toward its end is to produce a fruit or whatever, right? Whatever the vegetable or thing is. That type of quality, sentiment, and skill is something that I think is important in shifting the language. Because what tends to happen is people want to move faster than there's actually capacity. But when you're cultivating, the intentionality tends to times, seasons, and cycles. So that's where I'm like starting to shift the language that we're using. Dynamic. So again, shifting a lot of this stuff of a process or system characterized by constant change and activity. I crossed off progress, which somebody mentioned this in the keynote. They're like, well, don't you think I'm not interested in the goal over there? I'm interested in what we can do and or be right now that is supportive of where we're at. And when our frame of mind is dynamic and the way we approach things is through a dynamic framework, it changes our reaction and response ability. So more our responsibility than our reaction, because those are the things we're not really ready for. So when something's happening at a collective level and something's happening at a personal level in your life and all these things are intersecting, we are trying to teach people tools that have a methodology in order to self-regulate, but that's getting actually in the way of understanding life and understanding what for the moment is needed, and to be willing to step outside and do things that make sense and resonate for you is going to be the thing that saves your life. Having to stay with a prescribed way of doing something, right? Challenge is challenging because the prescribed way may not be accessible in your cognitive mind when there's a lot of challenge. And so that's why people are like, oh, they have this whole yoga sequence, but when shit is flipping, they're not able to step into that because they're not able to regulate their system sufficiently to step into that. So rather than find something else to use or to be in relationship with, folks who get stuck where they're like, oh, I haven't done my yoga practice in weeks. All right, fair enough. What else can you be doing for yourself? Maybe you can't slow it down for yoga, but maybe you can do some dancing in your house. Maybe you can't do either of those things, and the best you can do is like sweep your house, right? Like, just these are just examples, but you start having a dynamic relationship to change so that you're not waiting and stuck. And then you begin to craft a way of being in the world that works for you in terms of giving you an ecology that you can move and grow from, versus a stagnant, like curated garden that only this type of flower can grow. So that's what my mindset behind this is. And I'm kind of working on, it's a working thing for me now to really look at the ways we can shift this. Next up, he was Healing Center, which was part of the title, and shifting that to centering an adaptable ecology and praxis. So what I did, I gave some definitions because what I wanted to do was give a little bit of framework, but then drop into it without like trying to, again, be prescriptive. So adaptable, to adjust oneself readily to different conditions. Again, and this is where I'm talking about dynamic, right? So adaptable allows us to shift. It doesn't require us to stay with the same things. Ecology, the relations of organisms to one another and to their physical surroundings. The thing I want you to note here with ecology is that ecology not only is looking for the relationship of one thing to another, but also to the surrounding. When you've experienced a lot of shit, a lot of trauma, and you're still in recovery, hyper vigilance and anything hyper oriented is a hyper awareness that comes as a result of that. Is often something that you spend the rest of your life mitigating and monitoring and things like that. And I wanted us to have an understanding that it's all like information for us to be dynamic in, right? And adaptable in. And that we're navigating between our external surroundings and our internal, right, like emergings. and that this ecology, looking at all the relationships between the tree, the poison ivy, the jewelweed, right, the short grass, the long grass, the what is considered an invasive plant, where there used to be this, its relationship to the water system in the area. All those things matter, and however you name that in your life is going to be the place of access and power for you, right? Like, and what by power I mean choice, embodied choice, where you're able to embody the choice. Now, and this is to me the thing that we're getting tripped up on, because you or I may assume that everybody has an embodied choice in that, or a choice to embody it, and they may not, because of whatever the intersections are that of oppression that they live in. And so this is where there's a lot of arrogance in the healing community, because everybody wants to get everybody fixed, and some shit just don't fix like that. And so if we begin to shift the way we're holding the information, the framework, the container, and the language we're using, it creates just a little bit more, if you will, neuroplasticity to shift into a dynamic space. And that's what we know. We know dynamism, if you will, because as creative beings, we have, like, you know, the fight, fright, freeze, and fawn responses. We have what happens when we're at ease. We have what happens when some of our bodies are carrying other humans. We have what happens, the chemicals that are released when we are feeling connected in intimacy with others. We are dynamic. We are change itself. And so to shift this orientation gets us moving from, like, I don't, like, you know, I may not be able to do breath work right now, but I'm going to sing. And singing can be the equivalent of breath work. But because I don't think it looks like me sitting on a yoga mat meditating or being quiet, I disqualify it and don't notice that I have a natural way of engaging what I need if I listen to myself. Right? So if I would go and, like, this particular day I'm feeling away and I turn on the music and I sing, I meditated, I prayed, like, all of that was all in one. I took time. And even if that meant that I'm washing dishes while listening to music, I'm still connective, right? And it's dynamic, and I'm cultivating and using different tools to regulate my own nervous system, because I know that when I wash dishes, it calms me down. Now, I'm just saying that because it is calming and meditative to wash dishes. I don't do it as often as I probably would like to. Anyway, here's praxis. It's practice as distinguished from theory. And again, this is important, shifting out of the normative. And what I want you to know about this is that this is not one of those things that we're like, oh, I should know this. And so how does this look in my life? It looks like this, that, and the other. Or, you know, step 1, step 2, step 3. No, this is embodied. So there's no formula to anchor and say to you or say to me, it has to look this one way. It's teaching us to avail ourselves of tools that help us to be responsive to reaction, responsive to regulation, responsive to our environments. And when we do that, we're able to step into a deeper listening, and we're going to need this. We need it, period. But moving forward, we're going to need this. So here's another quote. Our ancestors knew that healing comes in cycles and circles. One generation carries the pain so that the next can live and heal. One cannot live without the other. Each is the other's hope, meaning, and strength. Gemma B. Benton. Then she sang a willow song, reclaiming life and power with the ancestors. So much of this is this very, like, both directive and convoluted history that many of us have, where our ancestors bore so much pain and so much burden for us so that we could, you know, like, and that's the idea of parenting, right? We say, oh, I want my kids to have a better life than I did. What you never asked was, what's the life that they need? And so one of the things that we can be conscious of is the way that we're all interconnected, but also the way that your generation is meant to do something different, and maybe not so much carry the pain anymore, but be able to really name the challenge and name the edges and be with, right? So like being. So I thought it was just really beautiful, and we are each other's hopes. That's for sure. So I closed this particular piece just acknowledging, I wanted to acknowledge, because in spaces like this, we usually don't acknowledge these things. And so this keynote was about creating the space to notice and witness. So what I did was, after this, I stepped into the following. This image of this child crying reminds me of my siblings when they were small. And the question that I posed to the audience was the following: what are you mourning? What are you grieving? It was important for me to use visual, images, and to engage the visual, because I wanted the connection between your eyes, your brain, and your body to be intact as I was moving through kind of this offering, and moving people through this space. And so people just loaded all the things. I mean, there was folks that lost people to COVID. There was folks who lost relationships. There are folks who's, just enormous jobs, just enormous, an enormous list. There was like 200 plus people, and it just poured in. And just the moment of witnessing each other and the ways we're experiencing pain that we're suppressing and pushing back. In this slide, I offered, what are you mourning? And maybe for you, if it feels generative to take the time to journal this, or maybe you want to share it in here, absolutely, there's a place to witness for that. Next up, I asked folks, what did they see? And some folks were some folks were like vacation. Some folks were mountains, freedom, all those beautiful things. And so the question that I posed, which this was I went through a very similar exercise recently in a class that I'm taking, and it was directed toward pleasure specifically, but I thought it would be a great place for us to come to reconnect to the sensory operation in our beingness, to again re-engage our humanity, to liven the things that have become dull during this time of extraordinary challenge. So the question I asked is, what is one thing that's your favorite thing to see? What image, what is that for you that you love to see? Like, I love looking at kind eyes. I love looking at sceneries like this, mountain ranges and forests, rivers and oceans. Like, what is something that brings you joy when you look at it? And so again, people flooded, and we had a moment of witnessing. All types of responses came through, which I absolutely love. Next up is smell. Again, what are some of your favorite smells that bring you joy? And then I would ask folks, like, can you actually smell it? Some of us that memory is so linked that you can actually access the smell of something if you wanted to. And this is just, fascinating extra. This is going to sound a little weird. Okay, fair enough. I can still smell like my boyfriend when I was like 12 years old. Like, his particular cologne with his body scent was something that's just stuck in my senses, and I can still conjure it up so many years later, right? So the question was, what's your favorite smell? What's a smell that brings you joy? And again, people flooded that in. And then again, I asked the question, can you smell it? Next up was, what is your favorite taste? Really important, right? Again, we're doing the senses, and people flooded in like tastes that bring them joy, chocolate, wine, food. I mean, it was wrong. It was wrong of me, because we started getting hungry. It was so bad. But again, people shared what that looked like for them, or is tasted like for them. Next up was sound. So this particular slide actually was connected to the sound of the ocean. What's your favorite sound? What's a sound that brings you joy? And of course flooded in with like children's laughter, grandchildren, music. I mean, just a little bit of everything, which was really amazing. Next after that was touch. What is a touch that brings you joy? And so many different types of responses, which was amazing, right? Like really like back to the senses and back to the place of creating just a little bit of breath to rehumanize, so that we can start talking about and thinking about afterward, after you're awake again to your senses. And we know this, that like with trauma, we recognize the need to use different like exercises that help us regulate in relationship to our sensory system that often goes offline or hyper aroused, or actually even the opposite, right? Shut down because of our experiences or any cognitive dissonance we're experiencing. And so again, back to these really fundamental, what do you like to feel and touch? And there were so many amazing responses, and funny too. The one after that is actually the best. Probably not the best. I'm sure there's better. But an image of our like electromagnetic field, if you will. Now, there's science behind this in terms of like how far out the heart, vibes go, or electric field, whichever. And so one of the things I wanted to, that probably came out loud. One of the things that I wanted to address here was outside of our physicality is how far out we're sensing, right? Like far out of our physical being. And I wanted folks to understand that for those who have experienced like hypervigilance or extrasensory capacities. Now, in language of priestessing and mysticism, we know that that's right, like our psychic abilities. Oh my gosh, how am I forgetting that now? Whether somebody hears things, feels things, sees things. I cannot remember the name of those things right now. Oh my gosh. Anyway, but you get what I'm saying. I wanted to bring that into the conversation, because what I want us to do is, in shifting the culture, I want us to name this. I want us to name that we are reading and picking up outside of the common named senses. And that when we're able to acknowledge that, we're able to even remotely like bring a little bit of like understanding, if you will. That's a horrible word. But a degree of sight around the fact that when there's so much moving, there's so much informing of space and time, and not just, the senses that we want to acknowledge. And so the exercise for this was very similar. I asked folks if they felt comfortable to close their eyes in this one. And if not, to find a soft spot where they can focus. And then I want them to be able to connect, like, what do they sense outside of themselves? And it was really fascinating, the responses. Like some people were like the light in the office, or the sounds outside, or the sounds in the office. Like some things were very like still connected to a kinetic type of energy. And then other folks were definitely sensing a room and a space. And so this was really to, again, create the space of noticing and witnessing. Because I could give a shit how much you study. If you're not being with it, you can't, there's nothing you can do. You're going to be able to, it's rhetoric. You're going to be able to say it. You're going to be able to think you understand it, but you won't be able to be it. And we need to be it so that when we're with each other or when we're with others, there's enough spaciousness in that to acknowledge all that's there, and enough pause to rehumanize, so that then we can tend to the work of justice, equity, and all those things, right? And cultivating a dynamic, adaptable ecology. Sometimes semantics are like, oh, it's just semantics. And sometimes it's not. Sometimes the way we layer upon layer upon layer of language and words and theory in something, we are creating those pathways in our brains that automatically turn to that belief system or turn to that idea in order to re-anchor and create the same loop, which is why habits are challenging to change, because there's already a pathway that fires off. Once you do one thing, it does the next, and the next, right? And we talk about that. We're so, high on productivity. We talk about that so much. And at the same time, of course, you won't be able to access something new because you believe the pattern to be the truth and the thing that's going to get you where you want to go. So in some ways that, there's like your brain goes to sleep because you're doing something that is habitual. So you can't be dynamic with that. You actually can't be adaptable to an external or internal shift because you're dependent on that particular frequency or that particular like pathway that's been shooting the same thing, right? Like get up, brush your teeth, I don't know, use the bathroom, that type of thing, right? Over and over and over and over. So we count a lot on that automatic reaction and response. And so in order to shift these bigger things, we're going to have to hone in and come in a bit to reframe in order to be able to kind of like free out how people get so stuck in these particular fields and the way they're moving, and also how harm is done, so that we can be about harm reduction in our work. So same thing, folks answered this and it just poured through. The next one is intentional. It's a blank slide. And this, I offered up the idea of creating the container yourself rather than somebody assigning a container for you to hold information, which is what trainings do, which is what, I don't know, education does, right? Like all these things are meant to create these containers for which you are moving through. The invitation was to create your own container so that it resonated for you and it sounds like something you can do because you know it, rather than you trying to like use somebody else's container for something. So I offered up, like, I use circles when I'm creating a visual imagery of something, and that helps me remind myself that things are, a spiral and cyclical and seasonal, and not just a linear existence. And so I offered that up, and what I asked folks to do was to create circles or whatever it made sense to them, a tree, whatever it is. And what they want to do is put in, and this is an exercise I've done in other ways, so it's not a new thing, but it's really learning to create a framework from your own context and your own kind of, thesaurus and dictionary, etc. I'm trying to think like I think, your own index or something like that, bibliography, etc. Right? Like your shit. Look at the aspects of your life, however you want to frame those. If you start getting too complicated where you're like, oh, like job, work in the world, or calling, then create as little containers as you can. So if you can thematically put them under one shape, then that's great, right? So like you don't have too many moving pieces. And then the question that I asked was twofold. It's actually two questions, not one. The two questions that I posed is, what is generative, filling and nourishing, and what is depleting? And I wanted them to walk away with this, to really like not even try to do it then, but to take it home and witness for themselves what areas of their life are actually feeling good and which ones are sucking the life out of them. Because the energy that we need to be connected into and cultivating in our lives is not going to come in addition to all the space that's taken up already with the shit that's draining and leaking, right? And then like most often than not is like a small little place for things that are generative. So I wanted to name that, and I left this blank so that there is not any like our predisposition is to want to be given a container and a tool. And again, in order to cultivate adaptable ecology, we have to be able to interrupt the way we do it, right? So this was an attempt to do that, which I'm sure some people felt uncomfortable with, and others were like, yes, finally I get to do my own shit. Um, so having left them with that, I thanked everybody and closed with the hope and the desire that this would have been generative, connective, rehumanizing. And in addition to that, that the praxis was in the practice, and learning to be responsive to that, and to cultivate that responsiveness is where we're at as a community. And so that was the keynote. Like, that's the summary part. Of course, I put this at the end. If you want to find me, you can find me here. And I hope that kind of giving you the background about like my thoughts behind the way I created this, but also walking you through it. I hope that it was helpful. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. And if something resonates with you and maybe what's new for you about this. And also, the extraordinary support. I can't speak high enough of like Rebecca Guasson, who is like I think that sis, if I messed up your name, forgive me. So supportive and part of the KCIT team, so amazing, and I'm so grateful. Also, shout out to my homegirl Angela, who brought me in one of her workshops at the KCIT conference maybe 2 years ago or a year ago. And that's how folks came across me. So I'm so grateful for it. So there it is. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you soon again, my friends. Adios.